Hi, friends. Please pray with me. Lord, open our ears to your word and our hearts to your love. Amen. Let's hear the story of the Transfiguration from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus took Peter and James and John up the mountain with him one day. As they were looking at him, it seemed like he turned into a different person. His clothes were dazzling white, and he was shining from the inside out. Then Moses and Elijah were there with him, and the three of them were talking together. Peter got really excited and said, "This is so good. I think I'll build a house for each of you so we can always be here together." It was a stupid thing to say, but Peter always blurted out silly things when he was scared. All of them were terrified at what was happening. A cloud came over them, and a voice from inside the cloud said, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Then, when they looked around, Elijah and Moses were gone, and only Jesus was with them. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus told them not to say a word about what they had just seen until after he had been raised from the dead. Wow. Jesus on a mountaintop, filled with God's glory and shining from the inside out. Most of Jesus' earthly life was spent looking a lot like us, humbly and humanly, with needs the same as ours. As one of us, we wonder, what did he experience? What did he desire deep in his heart of hearts? How did he figure out how to be faithful and loving? What did he need to carry out what God had given him to do? Jesus was born into a family who didn't quite understand him, and yet his mother stayed with him until the end. He made a family of his friends, like many of us do, and found love and companionship there. Jesus had productive work. In order to find God, he healed people and touched people. He fed them and taught them. He chose 12 flawed humans to share his ministry, to witness teaching and healing firsthand. He often chose Peter, James, and John to be with him. They were with him on the Mount of Transfiguration and in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus took the time he needed to be alone. He often went off by himself, or at least he tried to. He sought silence in which to sense God's presence. If we don't get that time alone with God, we suffer. Jesus surrounded himself with the company of faithful people who had gone before him. The prophets that Jesus read, we read too. And as the gospel tells us today, he stood beside them on that mountain and spoke to them face to face, Moses and Elijah, as God surrounded them with glory, filled him with his glory, took him to a place of God's glory. As he moved closer to his death on a cross, I think Jesus specifically wanted to know that he was God's beloved. He needed to know that God was beside him, was within him, was waiting for him in God's future. The words he heard at his baptism, "This is my beloved," are the words which kept moving him forward. He hears those words again today in the story we just heard, coming from a cloud of glory. We too belong to God and are beloved by God, and there's nothing we can do to change that. Jesus needed to be renewed, recharged, rebooted, if you will, just as we do. It's easy to turn the stories about Jesus into stories about us, and that's not a bad thing. But this story of transfiguration, is about God, the holy mystery of God's glory, overflowing and undeniable. the holy mystery entering into human experience. That's what Peter, James, and John witnessed in the person of Jesus. That's what Moses witnessed on Mount Sinai as he spoke with God. The Old Testament tells us that Moses positively glowed after he encountered the Holy One, such that people were frightened at the sight of his face. Peter must have been glowing too when he blurted out that he never wanted to leave that place, that he always wanted to be at that rare place where everything was clear and goodness and light enveloped him with no effort on his part at all. The story also invites us to experience the glory of God. The disciples might just have missed the revelation of God's glory before them because of their sleepiness, but they didn't miss it. By the grace of God, somehow, they stayed awake and saw Jesus as he truly was, the embodiment of God's glory right in front of them, and it transformed them. They didn't go to that mountaintop on their own. Jesus took them there. Then God had to overshadow them with a cloud, had to wipe out all their distractions so they could receive what God was doing. And God cleared their palate so they could taste the sweetness of God's goodness. Our lives are full of distractions, noise, compulsions, addictions even. If we can stay awake and not be dragged down into our sleepy, most comfortable selves, perhaps we too can glimpse God's glory and God's amazing goodness. Perhaps we too can be astounded by God's greatness. That's why the scriptures tell us so often that we have to stay awake. Perhaps there have been moments in your life when all is crystal clear, and time and space stand still, and God is made known to you in all God's glory, like on the Mount of Transfiguration. If so, you are truly blessed. Most of the time, we live in the tension between the glorious and the miserable. I believe a good and loving God is with us every place in between. I believe just as Jesus needed, we need each other to rejoice in the fabulous moments and weep together in those moments that threaten to leave us without hope. We need to remind each other that we are God's beloved. I invite you, even as Jesus invited and perhaps even dragged Peter, James, and John, to stay together as we walk this journey, to place yourself in a place of prayer where you can be open to places and faces in which God's glory can be seen and can sustain you, and not miss what God has in store for you along the way. I invite you to stay awake despite your limitations, and to be ready to behold the glory of God among you and around us all. Amen. God bless each and every one of you.